college students have degree requirements. Those are plans and things that they plan to finish. You've heard the term bucket list used quite often, which could refer to big things that you want to get done on your house or your car or whatever, or it might be a vacation spot. But all these things deal with something down the road you're looking for a future. And as I talk about this, and I was thinking through all this, I'm thinking, David, they don't really want to hear about plans. You don't like to hear about other people's plans, except if they have some nice photos here and there, but not too much. And I realize even more so probably on God's plans. And the fact is that oftentimes we don't really concern ourselves with other people's plans or God's plans, unless, of course, you happen to be in an airplane and the captain says, both engines are out, and we're going down. Then you think, what are those plans we were talking about back a few years ago? Those would be times that you would want to remember God's plans. Or if you're in a doctor's office and he uses the word terminally ill, those kind of shake you a bit, and then you want to hear about it. But today, no, you've got plans of maybe where you're going to eat lunch or what you're going to do tomorrow or this evening or something like that. And God's plans, truthfully, when you thought about it coming in, may not have fit in that mindset. Now, Satan has a way of doing things in our mind to distract us, to detour us from greater important things and have us focus on smaller things. And that's not unusual. It was part of Satan's plan in the beginning. You know, when God had Adam and Eve in the garden, things were set up there. Think about this for a moment. Pretty much exactly the way God had planned for things to be in the end. They were with God. They talked with God. There was no death, no pain, nor sorrow. Sounds a whole lot like Revelation 21, where John, writing now prophetically, talks about the new Jerusalem, the new heaven, the new earth, when God will come down, everything will change, and no more pain, no more sorrow. And that's what they had in the garden. You see, it was a snippet of what God's plan was for man. And then Satan came along and said, hey, let's think about trees for a minute. I don't know that Eve thought about trees, but got her attention off of the big plan, and all of a sudden trees became the plan. Kind of silly when you think about it, but that's the way we are. And you move through the Old Testament, you come down to the New Testament, and to the book of Hebrews, which by term, Hebrews, is written mostly to Jewish people, but they're the Jewish people that have come out of Jewish background and into Christianity. But they got concerned about the Old Testament plans and felt like maybe they were being left out of some big things. And so the book of Hebrews lines up comparisons of Old Testament things in comparison to the New Testament reality of things, only to show that God has a better plan in this whole process, and that's what happens. But in chapter 8, if you just look here for a moment, there's an earthly ministry that's being described, and this earthly ministry is being compared to for the Jewish people. Verse 1, you might notice here, he talks about a main point. After all he's got to, he says, now this is the main point. This is the main point of the things we're saying, he says. We have a high priest like they did in the Old Testament he's been talking about, who is seated now at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. He's not over here in a temple somewhere. This one's in heaven working. And as he talks about it, verse 2, he's a minister of the sanctuary of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected, not the one by man. What a difference now he's saying. He talks about the high priests and their working and all this and their operation. And then verse 5 he says, these men, the ones in the earthly tabernacle, serve the copy and the shadow of the heavenly things as Moses had divinely instructed them when he said, make a tabernacle. So he did this according to a pattern, it says, that was shown to him on a mountain. And so think about it for just a moment, because what's really happened for the Jewish people is they thought they had the reality of being connected to God, and to come to find out it was just a copy, or really better described as a shadow of the real things. Now, for the Jewish people, hang in here with me, we're talking about plans. For the Jewish people, their life, they had lots of plans like we do, to-do list, bucket list, vacation list maybe, or whatever. But the big thing was, out of all that, the most important thing was getting to the tabernacle and being connected to God. They were good people. And now, what's being said here is we got something even better than that plan in Christianity. So our earthly plans, our to-do lists are down here. The Jewish people had a connected plan with God in the tabernacle. And then here comes the book of Hebrews to come along and say, but that, which is better than the other, is only a shadow of what's going on. It's interesting watching kids play, because as we're looking at these things here, and what we see that distract us, it's not even the shadow. Now, shadows are funny. Everybody's seen shadows, and matter of fact, with enough lighting up here, I have somewhat of a shadow. I was back a week or two, or a month or so ago, watching a little boy discover shadows. It was the funniest thing. He looked down, there it was. Kind of moved around in it. So he'd step on it and move with him. He was discovering his shadow. And now we find out that the best thing that we ever had on earth was just a shadow. They thought they discovered something great, and it wasn't even worth a distraction. You see, it's what God's saying here. So if that's the truth, then hang in here with me, because we're talking about something greater than the distractions that they have. And what we have in thinking about and considering God's plan for us. And here's what's described in verse 7 and following. For if the first covenant, that's back in the Old Testament, had been faultless, God didn't make it faultless. He built it a certain way, but it lacked the salvation that God had planned for the New Testament. But it was faultless, as he's describing here. Then no place would have been sought for a second covenant. But finding fault with them, he says, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, the Jewish background. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers, when I took them by the hand and I led them out of Egypt, because they did not continue in my covenant. And I disregarded them, says the Lord. This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, says the Lord, I put my laws in their mind, and I'll write them on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And none of them shall teach his neighbor or nor his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall already know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Wow. There's a plan. You see, God has a better plan than we could ever have on any to-do list, unless you've got to write this off, God's plan. Because that's what God's trying to tell us here in all the things that we seem to get distracted with. One of my favorite passages, I've quoted a few times, Jeremiah 29:11. And it's from the New International Version. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. That's descriptive, really exactly what God's looking for. I use it sometimes just talking about God not forgetting us. And that's a part of it. But the real essence out of it is God says, I'm going to get you home. That's my plan. It's a tough plan to follow for a lot of reasons. Number one, this earth has a lot of drudgery to dig through. Included in that are all these things that Satan comes along and says, hey, let's think about trees today. Or let's think about this or that. Distract us. Or these new little fidget things the kids got. You see them spin around and do whatever. It's amazing that something's replaced the electronic gadget that you push on and do like the adults carry, you know. We all have things that distract us. But if we could just set all those things aside and grace the greatness of God out of His creation, and consider what He has planned for us. It's an amazing thing. It's a peaceful thing. And God is trying to tell the Hebrew nation here that came over to Christianity, don't waste your time with all this other stuff, because I want you to live at peace on this earth, even in the midst of persecutions, which they were dealing with a whole lot. Now, the thing is, as we think about that, part two, I guess you could look at in this study here, is that we can mess the plan up. God's got the plan over here. It's taken care of through His Son, Jesus. And if we take part in that plan, we become a Christian. We're on the right plan. Insurance plan, you can call it. But we can mess it up. We can thwart the whole thing that God has going. Much, I guess, like a child would do, whose everything seems to be safe and secure in his life, and then all of a sudden he does something stupid, not considering the consequences of what it might be. Now, you've all seen kids do stupid things. We hear about ministers doing things like jumping a creek in Africa, full of sewage and crud, but because his brother, who happens to be here today, happens to dare him, but you can't do it, he gives it a go. And half an hour later, parents are still trying to clean the sewage and crud off of it. The kids do dumb things, don't think about that. Like climbing up on the shed roof, thinking that this sheet will be like a parachute when I jump off. I'm glad that was a short climb. But our ideas and our things aren't nearly as good as God's. Even as adults, in some things that we have plans for. And we can come up with some doozies as adults. Don't want to go through all the things that you probably see and hear about on TV. But it's so utterly amazing how lately kids can be locked up in cars and forgotten about, and lose their last breath inside a hot automobile, aren't they? Where do our minds go as adults when we forget who we are? Now, I paint all these pictures to talk about either the young or the old, only to allow us to think about how easy it is for us to forget about the big plan that God has for us, and how it's meant to give us security and peace while we're living on this earth. Now, Satan is out there trying to thwart it, and this is partly what the book of Hebrews is talking about. Look back at chapter 2 for just a moment. We'll look at a couple verses there. So as the introduction of the book of Hebrews is talking about what God has done, which is greater than anybody else, he says, therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things we heard, lest we drift. That idea of drifting conveys just a subtle mood. It's not just dramatic out the door. You don't even realize you've moved. But you've moved just a tiny bit. Get these kids lined up for them, taking pictures of them once in a while for Melanie up at school. And it's like, okay, just move over just a tiny bit. You're not quite on camera. Now go back over the other way just a little bit. And that's not drifting. But drifting, you all understand. Boats drift. Cars can drift if it's out of gear or in neutral. Just this casual, non-intention is what now the author is saying here. Be careful lest you drift, because, he says, if the word spoken through angels was steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a reward, how shall we escape if we, and then here's a new word here, neglect such a great salvation? When you're drifting from, and then all of a sudden you're neglecting it because, I'm busy with something else. You know, our lives are full of many something else's to keep us busy. Anything to distract us, to neglect the greatest plan that God has out there for us, and how wonderful it is. Or chapter 4 in verse 1. Therefore, again, as he's building his case throughout the book of Hebrews, and he's done his comparisons, he comes back to another conclusion, basically the same, different words. Since a promise remains of entering his rest, that heavenly rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come short of it. Just not quite there, just short of it. which, kind of like jumping a ditch. You didn't quite make it over the other side. You just came short of it. Well, what a difference between getting it and not getting it. What a difference between getting heaven and not getting it. I don't want to come short of that. I'm looking at the faces of everybody that I love, and not a one I want to come short. And we go out in the world, and we meet family and friends and unknowns out there. And really and truly, there's not anybody we really want to come short of that. But the exhortation is really for the Christians that lose their connection with God. They just miss it. And sometimes we miss it and don't realize we've missed it. Like driving down the road and you think you've got the directions and you're following your GPS, which sometimes doesn't guide you the right way. And you're miles off, and God's shouting out, rerouting, as the GPS sometimes wants to tell you. There's something better out there, you see. Don't come short of it. Or the worst situation, a little further down in chapter 4, as he begins to quote Isaiah the prophet. He says again, verse 7, he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time, as if it had been said, today, if you'll hear my voice, do not harden your hearts. Tough, rugged. Don't tell me I know everything. And we got to be careful as a Christian that we can get so turned off, so hardened by whatever out there. A brother in Christ that may have said something, or you think they said something, or anything out there that causes you to just give up, and you've stepped aside. And then eventually your heart's so hard that the word doesn't sink in anymore, and this is what he's talking about here. And it's all because of stupid things, like kids or adults. They come along and just mess the plan up. And we're sitting here thinking, I'm not going to have that problem. I've got some other plans to do. It's like, oh, we all have plans of some sort. And the exhortation is that any one of us can drift, come short, neglect, or just get so hard-hearted that we drift away. I'm looking at an audience that's here today. And over the years, some faces drift, and some go away, and some get hard, and all of those things are a reality because Satan works on you and me on a day-to-day basis in every way he can. And it's so important for us. And so therefore, what do? And again, the book of Hebrews is giving an answer for the people, and you jump over to chapter 11, and there's an entire chapter written about faith. By faith this and by faith that. And what it means is trust God when he gives you a task to get it through. And so you see all these enormous tasks, big and small for that matter, that God is challenging people to do from Abraham all the way down through. And they performed those tasks because they trusted God to get them through. So here we are. We've got a plan. Matter of fact, chapter 6, verse 19 says, we have an anchor, talking about Jesus. Steadfast and sure. There's a song, matter of fact, directed or written about that. And boy, do we not need in troubled waters an anchor to hold us fast, to keep us from drifting, to keep us from moving away from God. And it's Jesus Christ. One of the most beautiful things we can think about is the fact that God's got a plan for us. You wake up in the morning and, Satan does a good one with me. I wake up and my to-do list has already been churning during the night. And I've got these things I want to get done and all these things that I've got to do and many others that will come along in my life just like you. Bucket list of things maybe I'd like to get to someday. And I need to stop and consider God's plans. Close my eyes to everything happening in the world and just look out. The clouds, skies, the majesty that God has put out there. And that this God that put all this out here has got it under control. Now, Lord, with you in charge, let's work on some of these things. And if something gets interrupted along the way, God, that's part of what you want me to do. I'm going to listen to that plan. God's plan involves people. Our plan needs to involve people. God's plan involves people getting to heaven. Our plan needs to be involved in us and anybody else we can along the way getting to heaven. We're going to come back and talk about this tonight. Tonight's a power night. We've got some breakout groups and discuss some of that if you go into that. But as you're thinking about wrapping all this up, I want you to think about what Jeremiah 29:11 says. I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to profit you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope, not a future. And a future. In Matthew 23, Jesus is very close to the end of his ministry. He's been with his apostles. He spent 3 years on earth. He's been out with all the different people. He's met a lot of people that are good followers that's come with him. And some who claim to be God's people that are so hardened to him, they wouldn't listen to him whatsoever. And in chapter 23 of the book of Matthew, there's a lengthy section where Jesus basically, as we would say, rakes over the coals the Pharisees. Their hypocritical background. Not because they didn't believe in God, not because they didn't practice giving, not because they didn't go to worship, but they never looked at Jesus, the answer. He wasn't the anchor, he wasn't part of the plan, and they couldn't conceive of him. And he pours his heart out. Chapter 23, toward the end, he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who persecute the prophets, how I've longed to draw you to myself as a mother hen gathers its chicks, but you wouldn't come. You wouldn't come. You came to the earth, and you wouldn't come." God has a plan. He's poured his heart out. He's poured his Son out for you. Consider how vital that is in your life, and make it a difference in your life. Let it be a difference in who you are, how you live. Trust the plan and make sure you include other people with you in that, because that's what it's about. But if you've not been in sync with God's plan, and you've not followed it, number one, and become a Christian, number two, lived it like you ought to, then let's get right tonight, this morning. While we stand and sing, please stand.